This is the second sermon that I'm bringing to you on this fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And the circumstances of the present time, I think, have made it necessary for me to split these messages into two. In the first sermon, which I gave about 3 weeks ago now, I needed to address the question whether the Sabbath commandment applies today. And I sought to show that the Sabbath commandment, as one of the 10 commandments, does apply today, with the distinction being that under the New Covenant dispensation, we observe the Sabbath not from Friday evening to Saturday evening as the Jews did. We observe it instead on the first day of the week, following on from the resurrection of Jesus, which took place on the first day of the week. So that was the subject that I addressed last time. The Sabbath is still in force, but the day has been changed. This second message will address the question, how then are we to keep the Sabbath day holy? How is it that this day is to be set apart from other days? Now, this is an important question for us to address today. It's important for us to address it today because there is very little teaching in the contemporary Christian church on this important subject. If you go back into history, this was a matter that Christian teachers and preachers were very keen to press upon their hearers and felt was very important for them to understand. But today, there has been very little teaching on the subject. And as the surrounding culture has become less and less nominally Christian, the ways of God have faded from view. And one of those ways of God that has disappeared is the Sabbath, the distinction between Sunday and the other days of the week. So we need to talk about it because we're not going to learn about it from anywhere else. We also need, and this is the better and higher reason really, we also need to talk about how to keep the Sabbath day holy because the Lord attaches great promises of blessing to those who set apart his day for him. And so if we neglect the Sabbath, then we're neglecting a source or a channel of amazing blessings into our lives. Let me read to you from the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 58, verses 13 to 14. God says, "If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honourable, and shalt honour him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words, then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it." So God there says, if you set yourself apart for the Lord on the Lord's day, then your experience of his blessing will be otherworldly and wonderful. So that's the promise of blessing. And my hope is that as I commend to you the Christian Sabbath as the scriptures lay it out, you won't think of this as a drudgery or a chore or an impossibility, but rather as an untapped, or perhaps only partially tapped, opportunity for blessing for you. There are two principal duties that we have on the Sabbath day, and I'll treat them in order as we go through this afternoon. First, I'll talk about the fact that on the Sabbath we need to refrain from work in order to rest. And then secondly, that we need to retire from the world in order to worship. And there is a caveat there, because we also do go into the world as evangelists, but we're to retire from our own involvement with the world in another sense. So first then, we are to refrain from work in order to rest. There's much discussion today about well-being, and perhaps there's more discussion about well-being and looking after yourself today than there ever has been in the past. I don't think that's a bad thing. People are concerned, for example, about getting the right work-life balance, about having time for family and for what is increasingly called self-care. There's a sense that you need to look after yourself so that you can thrive in life. There's much more awareness today about mental health, that the mind, or as Christians I think we would want to even say that the soul is like the body. It needs to be taken care of and looked after. And that if we press it too hard, then we'll develop problems, and those will worsen. William Gladstone was one of the most remarkable figures of the 19th century, when Britain was near the height of its power as a nation. He served as Prime Minister. He was Prime Minister 4 times and served as Prime Minister for a total of 14 years. He died at the age of 88 in 1898. And think, that's before all the medical advances of today. I think I probably would have died about 5 times already. I don't know about some of you. But with 19th century healthcare, he lived to the age of 88. And when Gladstone was asked to comment on his longevity, both the length of his life, but also his labours and how he was able to continue serving as Prime Minister even into his 80s, he attributed it largely to his observance of the Sabbath. He took God's day seriously. Even with all his responsibilities, he set it apart as a day of rest. And he says that God blessed him. Now that comes from the perspective of a man of faith. And if we are to seek blessing for our bodies and our minds God's way, then it's got to begin with the Sabbath day. Because that's the place where God promises he will begin to take care of us. The word Sabbath, which you find there in Exodus chapter 20 verse 8, means rest. And if you look at the verse, or the verses, it talks about God taking his rest. So verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Now, God doesn't need to rest. When God made the world after 6 days, he wasn't tired. God doesn't have a body that gets weary. And because God is an infinite spirit, his mind doesn't become overwhelmed and worn out in the ways that ours do. We read in Isaiah chapter 40 verse 28, Hast thou not known and hast thou not heard that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary. God doesn't become tired. But he instituted the Sabbath for our sakes. He had made man in his image, and so he made us to be imitators of him. And so having worked for 6 days in making the world, he then rested as a way of saying to us, this is what I want you to do. And Jesus confirmed that when he said in Mark chapter 2 verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So he made it for us, for our welfare and our well-being. The Sabbath was instituted as a day of rest. And so if we are to be those who seek the Sabbath blessing God's way, then we have to set that apart as a day of rest from work. Now, if you're in the workplace, this is an easy thing to think of, that you refrain from that work. Now, I'll go through some exceptions to that. There are some work that can't wait and that must be done on the Sabbath. But the general principle is, if it can wait, if it can stop, then it should. And so if you're in the workplace, you don't work on the Sabbath. If you're working in a shop, you don't open on the Sabbath, and so on, and so on. But we're obviously not all here in the workplace. There are some here who have retired. And yet in your retirement, you're not idle, are you? And there are many legitimate pursuits that you will do in the world during the week. Now, if those pursuits are not directly to do with God and his kingdom, then we lay those aside for the Sabbath, because they're a kind of work. If you're someone whose work is in the home, so a stay-at-home mother, for example, then as much as possible, the things around the home are to be done on other days, so that the Sabbath can be a day of rest. You know, cooking and cleaning and other things, as much as they can be done at other times, that's when they're to be done. Young people at school, the Sabbath is not to be a day to get your homework done. It's to be a day of rest from that. God has set apart a day where he wants you to down your tools. Now, that's the good news in a way, but the other side of it is it's got to be done at another time. And even for those who, like me, who are in the ministry, the Sabbath has got to be a distinct day. I try as much as possible to get all my sermons and other things prepared before Sunday so that I can be a worshipper and a receiver here. Of course, because there's physical exertion involved in preaching and other things, I need to take a physical Sabbath at another time, and I generally do that on a Saturday. So if you go into ministry in the future and you're involved in church work, then that will be something to consider as well. But in general, it's to be a day of rest from work. I mentioned that there are some types of work that cannot be put off, that must be done even on the Sabbath day. And Jesus himself, who never violates the Sabbath, acknowledges this, and he even presses it upon his legalistic Pharisaical opponents. So here are some of the exceptions. So Luke chapter 13 verse 15, doth not each of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or his ass from the stall and lead him away to watering? So where there's necessary care to be done, it's got to be done. And if Jesus says, well, you do that with your animal, of course we must do that with living men and women and children. So if you work in the care sector, for example, it may be that you're required sometimes or even frequently to work on the Sabbath day. That's not contrary to God's law. Jesus says in Luke chapter 14 verse 5, and we had it read in our New Testament lesson, which of you shall have an ass or an ox fallen into a pit and will not straightway pull him out on the Sabbath day? And this speaks of emergency work. So for example, those who work for the ambulance services and those who work in emergency medical care. Well, Jesus says if you had a beast that fell into a pit, you'd pull it out. And again, if that's the case with animals, how much more imperative is it with human beings in a situation of immediate and grave need? So the Sabbath is a day of rest from work, but there are some exceptions. Not only is the Sabbath a day when we ought to rest from work, but it's also a day when we ought to help others to rest from work as well and not do anything that would necessitate the work of others. So look at verse 10 of Exodus chapter 20 with me. Exodus chapter 20 verse 10. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. So this is you, this is me. Thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger, that's a foreigner or a friend that's staying with you, that is within thy gates. So the person that Moses, God here, is addressing primarily is the householder, or perhaps the person who has servants as well as children. And he's saying to the head of household, now, it's not that you're to put everything down, but everybody else is to wait on you for the whole day. And you can say, well, I'm not sinning against God because I'm not breaking the Sabbath. And then you get everybody else to do your bidding and your business. No, God is actually, this is, if you like, the origin of workplace welfare and of workers' rights. Because God says, no, if they are under your authority and they're in your care, then their Sabbath is just as imperative as yours. And of course, if Jesus says to us, love thy neighbour as thyself, then we have to do all that we can to help our neighbour have a Sabbath as well. And that's why doing things that require other people to work is unacceptable too. So for example,
I'm having trouble connecting to the internet.
So for example, this is why going to sporting venues and watching football matches is not something that we should do, because there are many people who have to work to make that possible. Or going to a restaurant. There are many people who have to be your servants in order for you to enjoy that restful meal. The Sabbath is not a day for that. So, because we love our neighbour, we extend that to other people. And just before I move on to the second point, let me say this. The Sabbath acts as an antidote to self-reliance. This is the wonderful thing about God's laws. They're not just a set of rules, but they actually, when you commit yourself to obeying them, they change your heart in good ways. So, we are tempted today to think that if I don't do this, then that won't happen. And if I don't do that, then everything's going to fall apart. And I just can't see how my life is going to work or fit together. But that is the language of self-reliance. And what God says in his word is, you're not to rely on yourself, but rely on me. And so you may feel that you need to do this and you need to do that. But on my day, I want you to put it all down. And let me do the work, says God. Let me look after you and take care of you. Commit yourself to my day, and I will sort out the things that you don't know, or that you don't know how it's all going to work together. And then you'll see God at work. It was a scary thing for me when I was at Bible college and had exams on the Monday morning, not to touch any of my textbooks on the Sunday. But the Lord always brought me through. And I did just as well, in fact better then, than when I was a Sabbath-breaking teenager. God took care of me, and I enjoyed his day. We can have that experience. So that's the first thing then, that we are to refrain from work in order to rest. Now the second major duty of the Sabbath is that we are to we are to retire from the world in order to worship. In life, in general, there are things that we think are worth celebrating. Anniversaries, birthdays. In particular, when we have a big anniversary or we have the birthday of a close relative, we will set apart time to celebrate that person or that couple. And we will be joyful about it. There may even be presents involved. Perhaps there's going to be a special meal that will be shared to mark the occasion. God has given us things to celebrate. And because the things that God has given us to celebrate are so wonderful, they're not supposed to be a once every 10 years thing or a once every 1 year thing. They're supposed to be a once a week thing, because God's blessings to us are so great. Exodus chapter 20 hints at one of the major things that we are to celebrate, which is creation. He speaks there of, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So on that seventh day, God took a step back and enjoyed and refreshed himself in the creation that he had made. And the man and woman that he had created were there alongside him, admiring his wonderful works, looking at how wonderfully he had provided everything in that beautiful and perfect world for them. And so we celebrate that. We celebrate the fact that we have a God reigning in heaven. We celebrate the fact that we have a provider who meets all our needs. We celebrate the fact that we are not alone, but have help. But actually, there's something even greater than having a creator, sustainer, provider that we celebrate on the Sabbath day. And if you turn over, please do turn over with me to Deuteronomy chapter 5. Deuteronomy chapter 5. And let me read Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15. And remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord thy God brought thee out thence through a mighty hand and by a stretched out arm. Therefore the Lord thy God commanded thee to keep the Sabbath day. So what Moses is saying to the children of Israel was, or God rather, you were slaves in Egypt, and God has set you free. And in Egypt, you were doing 7 days, long shifts. And you were under taskmasters who whipped you and treated you terribly. And now the Lord has brought you out, and he is your boss. And he's giving you a day off every week, because you're no longer slaves to a cruel master. You're servants to a gracious God. And so what the Sabbath is a reminder of is salvation. The fact that the children of Israel have been freed to be the servants of God. So you and I, when we set apart the Lord's Day, we set it apart to celebrate the salvation that Jesus Christ has won for us. Not that we've been freed from slavery in Egypt, but we've been freed from slavery to sin and Satan in our fallen nature. And not that we've been brought out into the wilderness and given a better work and life balance, but that we've actually been set free to be the servants of the Lord Jesus Christ in the world. And we have been promised a future glory which is so good it's called an everlasting Sabbath. So we celebrate that on the Sabbath day. And because that celebration is supposed to be so special and so important, the whole day is to be dedicated to it. Exodus chapter 20 verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. There are many things that are not work that are perfectly lawful on other days of the week. Playing sport, watching television, reading novels, and chit-chat with friends, all this kind of stuff. And as long as we do it in conformity to God's law and in moderation, it's not sinful. And yet on the Sabbath day, we're to set it apart for the worship of God. It is to be a holy day, not merely a day of physical and mental rest, but a day for the worship of God. There are different kinds of worship that we can do on the Sabbath day. There is the public worship of God. And this is why the church is open. This is why this is the day when believers meet together to hear preaching, to pray, to sing the Lord's praises, to gather around the Lord's table and remember all that he's done for us, and also to share fellowship with the body of Christ. So there's the public worship of God. There's family worship, in that at home and in your family you can speak of the things of God, and you can invite other people into your family circle to do that as well. You can spend more time sharing spiritual things, praying together, and so on. If you read that chapter from Luke 14, where Jesus is at a Pharisee's house on the Sabbath day, we have a good model there of spiritual conversation on the Sabbath day. And then there is the individual worship of God, that we can read edifying Christian books, we can spend more time in Scripture, we can meditate on the Lord and his works, we can seek him in prayer. Now, thought has got to go into how we keep the Sabbath day. It's a particular challenge with young children. And yet, if we seek the Lord and seek his help, then we will find it, and we will be enabled, as we read in that verse from Isaiah 58, to call the Sabbath a delight. So I said earlier that the Sabbath is an antidote to self-reliance, and that comes in as we consider it as a day of rest from work. I want to say here that the Sabbath is an antidote to idolatry, because there are many good things in our lives that we love too much, aren't there? Certainly when I was a lad, what I really loved was video games, and you couldn't get me away from them. And if I were told, there's a day in the week when you can't play video games, oh, I would have been upset. Oh, I would have been inconsolable. Why? Because it was an idol. It had a place in my heart that it shouldn't. A place where God should have been. The Sabbath is an antidote to idolatry, because you put to one side everything in your life that isn't the Lord. And you say, that can wait. Because today I'm going to focus on Jehovah. Jesus is going to be my God. And as you put those things in their place on the Sabbath, you'll find increasingly that they find their place, their proper place, on the other days of the week as well. Coming then to conclusion. Perhaps you're thinking, this Sabbath sounds a bit difficult. How am I going to be able to keep the Lord's Day in the way that you're saying? How am I going to be able to hold back from doing all these different things that I enjoy, or from going to work? How can I do it? Well, people manage to set apart time for things they really care about, or for things that are rewarding. If you think about it, I went through an eye surgery that involved quite intricate stuff. The surgeon had to be very skilled, and because my eye was especially complex, I'm sure that when he was operating, he wasn't thinking about anything except this eye. He wanted to do a good job. And if you have a vocation that's particularly worthwhile or important, you have to dedicate your whole self to it while you're doing it. In fact, you're paid, let's say you're paid to do a job for 40 hours a week. For those 40 hours, you're supposed to be totally on that job, doing all that you can, because that's what you're paid for. And people will do that for money. The blessings that God promises you for setting apart these 24 hours for Him, and in fact, not even all of them, because some of them you're asleep, the blessings that He promises you for setting apart the Sabbath are so much greater than any money you could earn in any job. Will you not do it? Will you not see it worthwhile? Will you not make the effort and have a go? See what happens? And another common objection that comes our way when we encourage people to keep the Sabbath is, well, nobody else is doing it. I know loads of Christians who don't keep the Sabbath, and so why should I? What difference will my keeping the Sabbath make in a world where very few do? How does social change happen? Social change happens when one person, one man, one woman, sometimes even one child, takes a stand and says, I'm not going to go along with the culture. I'm not going to do what everybody else is doing. I'm going to do what's right. And then when that one person does that, other people are emboldened. And they start to think, if you're going to do that, and so will I, because it's right. And then a movement starts. That's the place that we are in when it comes to the Sabbath day. I believe that God has many blessings that He is holding out to the Christian church today. But because we are neglecting one of His principal commandments, we as a church are under His discipline. The decline in the Christian church in this country is beyond belief when we compare where the church is today from where the church was in better days. And one of the reasons that I think we are under the Lord's discipline, and the Bible encourages us to think this way too, is that we are not obeying the fourth commandment. So my challenge to you is this. Will you take a stand for the Lord? Will you put this commandment into practice in your life? Will you make trial of the Lord and see and prove His faithfulness? If you do, then you might be the beginning of a movement back to the Lord. Let's pray together.